Okay, welcome everyone to the next video on complete rook endings brought to you from chess.com. This is FM Daniel Wrench, and let's get right to it. So today's subject is how to win with the corner pawn. Now, as we notice, as you probably noticed if you've studied any endgames, the corner pawns always seem to have their own set of rules. And king and pawn endings, the corner pawn is the only one that doesn't seem to win if your opponent's king gets in front. In many different endgames, you notice that the corner pawn is not always a win, and it's no exception in a rook ending. But we're going to start off right away in the position that is a win, and that is because the enemy king here, black's king, your opponent's king is cut off all the way to the bishop file, in this case the f file because we're dealing with an a pawn. When the king is cut off far enough, there is a very simple winning technique, and once you understand this idea, including the most important moment, which we're going to get to in a minute, and once you've seen that critical idea, shouldn't be a problem winning these endgames. So let's get right to it. Obviously, if you were looking at this position, you see that you'd like to get a queen with the pawn. You're unable to make progress at this point because your king is cut off by the rook. So your only option is either to agree to a draw or to try to change that situation by bringing your rook over. Now, the idea that many people try at first is a transfer of the rook to the 7th rank, which makes sense because if you could bring your rook to the 7th rank, it seems like the most optimal square because it shields your king from any future checks, immediately allowing you to get a queen. Only one problem. Bringing your rook to the 7th rank does not work in a corner pawn situation because of a little thing called checkmate, right? So, unfortunately, the most obvious idea, which would almost be comparable to a Lucena idea, bringing your rook to the 7th rank, trying to shield your king from checks, any future checks along the open file, doesn't work because the corner pawn and the rook now smother their own king and allow this checkmate idea. So very important, first of all, just to be aware that the 7th rank doesn't work. And you're going to see why that if you even try that idea, try bringing the rook to the 7th rank, and then realize that the last moment you were going to be checkmated, it would already be too late to win. You could stop the checkmate, but once you've allowed the opponent's king to get even just a little bit closer, the endgame is now a draw. So if you learn any piece of advice, first thing to remember is not to try to bring the rook to the 7th rank. It doesn't work, and for those who haven't seen the video, hopefully they would calculate far enough in their head to anticipate that in the game. But many people do not and allow the king to get too close and allow a draw. So that means there's only one other square. If we can't do the 7th rank, the only other square left available is the 8th rank. So let's go ahead and give that a try. Let's say we bring the rook down to the 8th rank, and seems like a pretty simple idea. We're going to force this rook to move away. As soon as he does, our king now has an escape square, and we can use that escape square to completely run away from the checks, and eventually black will have to sacrifice his rook for the pawn. Now, I wish it was that easy, but I made a critical mistake there along the way for black, and that was moving this king to d7 rather than d6. By moving to d7, I allowed the white king to have the escape square of c5. Now, if I'm drawing this endgame and I know the tricks and I understand the ideas, or even if I just calculate that, I'm not going to put my king on d7. I'm going to bring my king to d6. Now, this is going to change the winning method greatly. It's going to make it much more difficult, and if you haven't seen this idea before, it'd be very hard to find over the board. So, once we bring our rook over to the 8th rank and force his rook to move away, we try to bring the king out, hoping it's going to be just as easy, but it's not. Because after these checks begin, our king has no way to escape along the A and B files without losing the pawn, which means our only escape route is along the 8th rank. However, that brings a whole new feature into play, which is that our opponent can now threaten checkmate. So the question is, if he can threaten checkmate, how do we stop checkmate and not lose any chances of queening the pawn? Well, there's only really one move here to consider, and you can probably see that. That's to give the rook check. Obviously, escaping with the king any further is going to lose the pawn. And trying to move the king back would only repeat the situation we were just in of endless checks. So our king reaches the d8 square, our opponent threatens checkmate, and we give this obvious move check. But now when our opponent goes to c5, we're still not out of the woods. Here we have the problem of not only the fact that our rook is hanging, but if we queen, he has the opportunity to give check and win the queen. So here's a good moment where we would recommend to take a pause and try to see if you can solve the winning idea here, which is there is only one move here, only one move that wins in this position, which is kind of rare, always hard to teach things when there's only just one thing you just have to know. A lot of the time when you're studying these types of endgames and studying really any endgames on your own, you want to always recognize patterns, things that repeat themselves where, you know, typically in a knight endgame, the knight does this, or, you know, in a rook endgame, we want the rook behind the pawn, etc. These are ideas you pick up over time. But there are always exceptions where sometimes you just have to know the idea and find the right move, and if you don't, it doesn't work. And so this is one of those positions. Only one move for white that wins here. So go ahead and take a minute. Okay, we're going to assume you're back. And the winning move, the only move that can save the rook and improve the chances of queening the pawn at the same time is a rook sacrifice. Rook to c6 check. Double exclam. Obviously, I can't take the rook because you immediately queen with check. And in a lot of normal books, this would not only be a queen with check, but even the win of a rook if the rook was on the h1 square. But here it's irrelevant because even if it's not a win of a rook immediately, if you know anything about king and queen versus king and rook endgames, you know that when the rook is separate from the king, the game will be an easy win. Probably a very simple series of checks here where at some point you should be able to pick up this rook. And we can come back to that. But obviously, he doesn't want to take that rook and even give you the opportunity to queen with check. So he has a choice with his king, either to run closer to the pawn or to try to stay in the center, which keeps threats of checkmate alive. Let's say that he tries to get closer to the pawn. Well, the advantage of this move is that it stops your rook from coming behind the pawn, which would then allow you to queen pretty easily. However, the disadvantage is that because he can no longer threaten checkmate, we bring our rook back to the 8th rank, now on the C file rather than the B file, which not only has stopped his king from threatening checkmate, but also given us a chance to shield our king from checks. Now, he has no other moves to consider here besides those checks. Obviously, we're threatening to get a queen in one move. And checking long ways is only going to run out of time eventually when our king has nothing to worry about but to get close to the rook. Again, with an endless chessboard, the rook could check forever. But here, the king will always catch up. So, when black brings his king, as we saw, when black brings his king closer to the pawn, he's lost the ability to threaten checkmate, which gives us a chance to bring our rook back to the 8th rank, not only helping to queen, but also providing a shield from future checks for our king. So bringing the rook closer, bringing the king closer to the pawn does not solve black's problems. What if he tries to move this way? Well, we've already kind of alluded to the fact that if bringing the king here was to stop this move, then obviously if he brings the king here to threaten this, where are we going to put this rook? We're going to put it behind the pawn. Not only does this move help to threaten to get a queen, but again, it also stops the threats of checkmate, the common theme. White found a way to help get a queen and stop black from creating his pesky checkmate threats. So without the ability to come forward and threaten checkmate, black will start giving checks. No need to try to run away from it because actually if you get too far, you can't go to the 6th rank because you would lose your rook. And if you get too far, now I have the opportunity to bring my rook in front of the pawn and my king is just close enough to draw. So in this case, you wouldn't really want to bring your king close to the rook to escape the checks, but rather seize the opportunity to escape along this diagonal. You bring the king to c7, he tries to give another check, and unfortunately for him, those checks are not meant to last. We eventually shield our king, and black has no way to stop us from promoting our pawn. Let's start back in again to the beginning position. So once again, we recognize that we have to get our king out which means we have to find a way to remove the rook off of this file, giving us at least one of these squares. We learned our lesson that coming to the 7th rank does not work because of the eventual checkmate idea. So we bring our rook to the 8th rank, giving us the out square on b7. Unfortunately, not easy to win because we can't escape through the queen side. However, if we understand this idea and we remember that trick of checking along the 6th rank, not once, but twice, including a sacrifice, if we remember this idea and take advantage of the fact that the rook cannot be captured without allowing queen with check, then we will always win these endgames. Again, if the king moves close to the pawn, we now have the opportunity to come back to the 8th rank. He doesn't have the ability to threaten checkmate anymore. Our king will shield itself, and the game will be over. If he brings the king this way, trying to threaten checkmate, we can now come behind the pawn, which not only helps us to queen, but also continues to keep an eye on this pesky d6 square. And after a small series of checks is given, the game will be over. Okay? So, pretty straightforward method. The key thing to remember is this double exclamation mark move. And again, just to touch on this, since I did, just to remind you that the king and queen versus king and rook is always a winning endgame. Theoretically, it is a winning endgame. Although it can be difficult, it's really only really a difficult endgame when the king and rook are already very close to each other and can protect each other. In a position where the king and rook are far away, it shouldn't be too difficult to figure out a series of checks to win the rook. Obviously, if he moves along this diagonal, we immediately win the rook. If he moves the rook anywhere to the b file, we immediately win the rook on b8. And the only square that seems to present a little bit of a tricky issue is c5. However, again, there should be an easy series of checks to win the rook. And let's say we start with this one. Again, the king can't come back to d6. If the king moves over to d4, even just cutting off the king from the rook should give us a winning idea within the next few moves. Anywhere along the 3rd rank and along the 5th rank, again, eventually a series of checks is reached and the rook should be lost. So just a good advice to remember that when the king and rook are separate, it shouldn't be too hard to win the rook. Okay, so quickly let's talk about the times when this endgame is not a win. And even if we just move everything over one file closer, we see that when we try the same idea of bringing our rook around, the king is there in time to stop us from getting out. So even upon removing the rook from guarding the b file, we still have no way to make progress here because his king is in perfect position. Any checks on the lateral side to side don't make a difference. You can even transfer over if you really want. Again, no checks on these squares are going to make a difference. And the point is that, like I said, the corner pawn always seems to have its own set of rules. So normally having the king in front of the pawn would be an easy Lucina win with just about every other pawn besides the corner pawn. However, with the corner pawn, if you do not have the king cut off, at least to the bishop file, as our original position showed, you will not be able to win this endgame because, once again, just to show, the idea of transferring over, which is our only way to make progress, will not get there in time, and we will eventually get a position where we've removed the rook, but now the king has taken up the task of stopping the king from escaping, and we will not be able to make progress. So, corner pawn principles. Starting backwards to forwards, the most important thing to remember is that if the king is cut off on the bishop file, it's a win. If the king is cut off any closer than that, if the king is any closer than the bishop file, the endgame will be a draw, unfortunately. Now, as we reach the more complicated positions and we actually see the winning idea in play, we have to remember that coming to the 7th rank could be a big mistake. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, coming to the 7th rank will not only allow the checkmate trick, but now that we understand that the king had to be cut off all the way to the bishop file, we see that just by letting his king that much closer, this endgame is already a draw. He's too close, and he's going to get control over these squares. So our only winning idea is to come to the 8th rank, And last but not least, we have to remember the cool, very cool trick, double exclamation mark move of sacrificing our rook, the rook that cannot be taken because we will queen with tempi, with tempo on the king every time, and the game is a loss for black. Either he moves toward the pawn, allowing us to shield the king, he can't threaten checkmate, or he moves toward the checkmate square, which allows us to come behind the pawn and with our king via the diagonal. Thank you very much. Very straight. Hopefully these ideas for chess. Good luck to you.